everybody. Assalamu alaikum. It's my great pleasure to be here tonight to share with you a very personal and subjective exploration about Islamic art and culture. And the lecture tonight is actually the result of an encounter with a high-ranking visitor I had many years ago at the Sharjah Museum of Islamic Civilization, who expressed genuine surprise at the fact that Islamic art should have anything to do with Islamic religion and spirituality. And I was somewhat taken aback by that, but his reaction reminded me that despite great strides that have been made in Islamic art scholarship, and despite many laudable attempts at broadening the subject beyond the art historical, the aesthetic and the stylistic, the way it is commonly perceived remains largely the same today. Most survey books, despite the Islamic in the title, do not grant this so important Islamic aspect much space, preferring to move within so-called secular approaches and interpretations that were actually established by Western scholars in the late 19th and early 20th century, and who remain prone to applying Western-centric, culturally conditioned gazes of the outsider to define and interpret a very sophisticated and complex other culture. As a result, as much in scholarly perception as in popular perception today, the term Islamic art has enormously broad definition, and it encompasses, very crudely speaking, all the material culture of Muslim lands and cultures from Spain to the borders of China, made by Muslim as well as non-Muslim craftsmen, for Muslim as well as non-Muslim patrons and markets, mainly ranging between the 7th and the 19th century, both within the region and beyond. And just to give you a visual impression of what this field looks like, you can see it is a very complicated one. From a Muslim perspective, meanwhile, the definition of Islamic art, if indeed it had ever existed, which it did not, is likely to have looked somewhat differently, particularly in the days predating the birth of Western Islamic art discourse in the 19th century. Indeed, when we look at the history of Islamic art from the Muslim perspective, it means, at least in the first instance, to explore the material culture and the artistic expression specifically related to, serving, or reflecting faith, and that within highly diverse and multi-layered historical, cultural, geographical, and indeed spiritual concepts and contexts, which can differ further from those of a powerful ruler at the top of a society to those of an ordinary citizen in the very same society. So let us start with the basics. Let's go back to the beginning. It was here, in a mountain cave above Mecca, which was a mercantile city very much controlled by an elitist tribal establishment and distinguished as an ancient polytheistic pilgrimage center, that the 40-year-old Muhammad bin Abdullah received the first of many revelations in Arabic from God, conveyed through the intermediary of the Archangel Gabriel in 610. The messages of these divine revelations related to humanity's need to submit to the will of the one absolute God, who was uncreated and without son or equal, belief in the angels as messengers and helpers of God, belief in earlier divine revelations and the prophets of God, including most prominently Jesus Christ, Muhammad as God's last prophet, the faith in the day of the last judgment, heaven and hell, divine law, and predestination. Given the revolutionary and egalitarian nature of his message, Muhammad and his early followers soon faced persecution in Mecca, and eventually in 622 they had to flee some 400 kilometers north to Medina. Here, Muhammad, in addition to being God's prophet, now became the leader of the first truly Islamic community. From this point onwards, believing Muslims lived in accordance with the will of God, their status technically determined only by their excellence as Muslims, not by traditional, temporal, societal, or tribal hierarchies and orders. Their religious beliefs, their social practices, their very way of life now became defined by the Holy Quran, the example set by the Prophet both in his behavior and in his guidance, and derived from those later through the centuries, Islamic law and tradition. In terms of ritual, 5 key duties established themselves. The proclamation of the Shahada, which is there's no God but God, and Muhammad is the prophet and messenger of God. Prayer, almsgiving, fasting in the month of Ramadan, and undertaking the pilgrimage or Hajj once in a Muslim's lifetime, if physically and financially able. After much struggle, Islam emerged victorious, and after Muhammad died in 632, his immediate successors, galvanized by the tenets of the faith and swept along by religious zeal, succeeded not only in conquering all of Arabia, but by 750, all the lands of the Byzantine and Persian Empire from Spain to the borders of India and beyond. In terms of material culture, virtually nothing survives from the day of the Prophet. And we have little idea what the first Muslims used and surrounded themselves with. In the immediate wake of the first conquests, they seem to simply have made use of the existing material cultures that they encountered, provided they met their needs and did not interfere with their convictions. At the same time, it is clear that they were concerned about 2 main things. First and foremost, the preservation and propagation of the Holy Quran in written form. Presented here by 2 fragments in the so-called Hijazi or Ma'al script on parchment, datable to the 7th or early 8th centuries. And secondly, provision for the expanding community to gather and congregate in prayer, i.e. the establishment of the first mosques, conceptually based on the ground plan of the Prophet's house in Medina, where Muslims had first assembled as a community. During the lifetime of the Prophet, the Word of God had been preserved largely in intangible form. As the revelations were received and recited by the Prophet, they were memorized by his followers and largely passed on orally. After his death in 632, the traditional Arab practice of passing on their most cherished intangible possessions or artworks was seriously challenged by the gradual dispersal and death of the Prophet's closest companions and the rapid spread of Islam across lands which were not only inhabited by peoples with very different languages, religions, cultures, and traditions, but which had been previously ruled by the mighty Christian Byzantine and Zoroastrian Persian empires. Both had justified their claim to ultimate power with religion, symbolized by formidable religious scriptures extant in material form. According to Islamic tradition, the Holy Quran was canonized and codified under the rule of the 3rd successor of the Prophet, the 3rd Caliph, Uthman bin Affan. With the help of the Prophet's relatives, his secretary, his close companions, and religious scholars. The final edition was copied and distributed to all the major centers of the fledgling Islamic Empire, Mecca, Medina, Basra, Kufa, and Damascus among them. It was these first codices that, in essence, were to form the basis for all subsequent Quran manuscripts made across the centuries, each one executed and revered with the conviction that it represents the material manifestation of the Word of God. For the next 1200 years, this conviction and the religious duty to memorize, recite, preserve, and disseminate that very Word of God ensured that Quran production remained a key activity across Muslim societies, and especially the ruling elite prided itself in commissioning spectacular copies for both public and private use. Carefully executed in all respects, their most important aspect obviously involved was the use of scripts worthy of the task of materializing the Word of God. It is astonishing how in a comparatively short period of time, the earliest, rather ungainly angular styles of writing we saw earlier morphed into a monumental, well-proportioned, and highly refined script. Exemplified here by a double leaf from a 30-volume parchment Quran, endowed in 875-6 by the governor of Damascus to a mosque in the city of Tyre in Lebanon, and probably intended for daily recitation during the fasting month of Ramadan. For nearly 300 years, Quran manuscripts continued to be executed in this monumental Kufic style. Then, from the 11th century onwards, formal but easily legible cursive scripts, which had coexisted with angular scripts from the beginning but had been used for secular and administrative contexts largely, suddenly came to predominate in Quran manuscripts, by now written on paper and made in large numbers. Fascinatingly, the reasons for this wholesale transition from angular to cursive script was not, as is often assumed, primarily related to the evolution of calligraphy as an art form. In fact, it rather appears that the causes lay with major political and ideological upheavals in the 10th and 11th centuries, when the Orthodox Sunni Caliphate in Baghdad was increasingly threatened by minor Shia dynasties, who in part appeared to have used the dissemination of Quran copies based on a rival version allegedly preserved by one of the Prophet's companions, Ibn Mas'ud. And this was done to challenge the central power's legitimacy and authority. Apparently, it was this severe ideological threat that in essence spurred the caliphs into ordering the reform and standardization of cursive scripts in view of facilitating the quick copying and distribution of easily readable canonical recensions of the Holy Quran. Subsequently, cursive scripts, and particularly the so-called Nasr script, became the norm for Quran manuscripts, their adoption reflecting the triumph of a theological view and all its political ramifications, as well as an artistic change. Up until the introduction of printing in the Islamic world in the 19th century, high-quality Quran manuscripts continued to be commissioned by the state and leading members of Muslim societies, a reflection of their sense of religious duty and the hope for divine blessing, but at the same time also reflecting culture and time-specific ideological, spiritual, and aesthetic preoccupation. Exactly the same can be said for the religious structures built across the Islamic world since Islam had established itself as an imperial as well as religious power in the Near East during the late 7th century. Here we have the Dome of the Rock. Unique in Islamic architecture, it is the first imperial building of Islam, the so-called Dome of the Rock, a magnificent octagonal structure erected by the Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Malik in 692, right at the heart of Jerusalem, a city holy to all monotheistic faiths, and the third most sacred city in Islam. Notwithstanding its artistic magnificence, we know from the sources that in fact every aspect of this building was carefully designed to herald the victory of Islam and the empires it replaced. Its location on the site of the ancient Jewish temple and built over the rock associated with the sacrifice of Abraham in Jewish, Christian, and Muslim tradition, its architectural design, which echoes but surpasses imperial Byzantine structures, marking key sites associated with the life of Christ in Jerusalem, and its decorative program, executed in extensive mosaic stones, and including Sasanian and Byzantine crown motifs suspended like trophies, as well as a monumental 240-meter Kufic inscription acknowledging the role of Jesus Christ as a prophet, but rejecting the Trinity and proclaiming that God has no companion and that Jesus must be acknowledged and blessed as God's prophet, but not as his son. The Dome of the Rock remains unique in design, decoration, and function, and symbolizes a very particular point in Islamic history, the establishment of the Islamic order, both religiously and politically, as the seal of what went before. Subsequently, the rulers and elite of the Islamic world focused first and foremost on providing the faithful with architectural structures designed to serve Islamic practice and an Islamic way of life. Most importantly, of course, communal prayer spaces or mosques. Represented here by, for example, the 9th century Ibn Tulun Mosque on the top left, the 13th century Seljuk Ala-ad-Din Jami in Turkey, bottom left, the 16th century Suleymaniya Mosque in Istanbul, and below the contemporary Jami Shah in Isfahan, just to give you a little feel also of how diverse these buildings looked architecturally and can look. As such, the requirements for a mosque are very simple and straightforward. You need ablution facilities for ritual washing, a spacious hall conducive to communal prayer, a mihrab or niche to indicate the required prayer direction towards Mecca, and generally, but not always, a minaret to call the faithful to prayer. How these elements were translated into architectural form, and particularly how they were decorated, could vary considerably across time and space, and depend not only on the religious but also the political objectives of the patron. Nevertheless, throughout, three features prevail: religious or spiritual inscriptions, geometric decoration, floral designs, and all of them designed mostly to cloak entire structures in a way that seems to draw the faithful into an otherworldly sphere of spirituality and meditation on the divine order, away from the concerns of daily life outside. The greatest care and consideration was given to the inscriptions, often chosen by the ruler personally in consultation with the most senior religious scholars and the most outstanding calligraphers of the day. The purpose? Conveying important messages of both religious doctrine and matters of state. Each building project was unique in this respect, and it is fascinating to see how structures can reflect sometimes rapidly changing religious attitudes and ideological priorities, even within one dynasty, like, for example, that of the Ottomans. This funerary mosque complex was built by the early Ottoman Sultan Mehmed I in Bursa in 1414 to 1424. And it was built to celebrate the restoration of Ottoman rule after a dynastic crisis that was triggered by the Ottomans' humiliating defeat at the hands of Tamerlane in 1402. Its inscriptions are executed in many different calligraphic styles, and they combine Quranic verses, a ahadith, i.e. traditions of the Prophet, and even quotations from Persian poetry to praise God, eulogize the celestial beauty of the mosque, pray for the Sultan's victory over his enemies, and damn those opposed to the continuation of the Ottoman state. How different the approach of Mehmed's most illustrious 16th century successor, Suleiman the Magnificent, or as Muslims call him, Suleiman al-Qanuni, the lawgiver, in recognition of his determined, fervent enforcement of Sunni orthodoxy and prohibition of all unorthodox practices associated with mysticism. Suleiman was in constant political and doctrinal conflict with the Christian Habsburg emperors in the west and the Shi'i Shahs of Iran in the east. And he saw himself as, I quote, supreme over all Islamic rulers as the divinely chosen vindicator, the interpreter of the luminous Sharia religious law as the shadow of God on all nations, and the Imam of the age who stands in the place of the Apostle of God. A conviction that incidentally put him in direct competition with his Iranian neighbor, who publicly propagated a very similarly worded claim, but from a Shi'i perspective. Against this background of competing imperial and religious dogmas and fierce sectarian conflict, Suleiman's mosques, like the Suleymaniya in Istanbul, built by the famous Ottoman architect Sinan in the 1550s, following the defeat of the Persian Shah, were consciously designed to emphasize the Sultan's authority as Caliphal Imam and his determination to propagate Sunni orthodoxy. Accordingly, here now, the inscriptions are exclusively Quranic and prepared in one particular style, clear, monolithic thuluth, a majestic style that became the classic style of the Ottomans in particular. And the verses exalt the Holy Quran as the exclusive and ultimate source of religious truth and the symbol of God's power over all things. Soon after Suleiman's death, things changed again. In the Selimiya mosque in Edirne, built by Sinan at the command of the Sultan's son and successor Selim II in 1572, inscriptions, I quote, so beautiful that they were veritable signs of God, ayat, and composed of rhythmically flowing letters compared in their fluidity to the rivers of paradise, combined with spring blossoms and floral motifs resembling the Garden of Paradise. The words chosen here include, again, traditions to emphasize the Prophet's role as messenger and intercessor, as well as the 99 beautiful names of God. Choices that relate directly to contemporary Sufi practice, mystical practice, and reflect the rising prominence of mystical orders during the reign of the patron, who slowly replaced the dry Puritanism of Suleiman with a more lenient and humanistic interpretation of Islam. In other countries, like Iran for example, Friday mosques reflected state dogma just the same. The Masjid-e-Shah in Isfahan, built between 1611 and 1638, was carefully conceived under the supervision of one single man, the local Sheikhul Islam, an Arab Lebanese scholar named Sheikh Bahreddin Muhammad al-Amili, who oversaw the architectural plan and all the epigraphic programs. And that not only in his capacity as a skilled architect and engineer, but also as an expert of religious law, an intellectual polymath, someone who spoke fluent Arabic and Persian, wrote Sufi poetry as well as treatises on mathematics and astronomy. Reflecting both his intellect and his Shi'i creed, this mosque project incorporates unprecedentedly profuse inscriptions, which combine sections from the Holy Quran, traditions, and poetry with historical quotations, all chosen to exude clear Shi'i messages relating to Ali's central. Ali is the cousin of the Prophet and the spiritual figurehead of the Shi'i community. So relating to Ali's central role as the gate of spiritual knowledge, the protector of the Sharia religious law, and the foremost mediator for human salvation. The role of the Safavid Shah as the propagator of the 12 Shi'i doctrine, and the determination to curse the tyranny of his enemies, the Ottomans. In short, the Masjid al-Shah, just like Ottoman mosques and indeed others throughout Islamic history, communicates strong dogmatic and spiritual convictions to its faithful and its opponents. Beyond the inscription, such convictions may also shine through in the geometric and floral designs that so often surround them. Geometric art, of course, has a long pre-Islamic history. It was used widely in Greek, Hellenistic, and Roman designs, but within the context of Islamic societies, they could assume a much more prominent role, and sometimes we have clear evidence that its application did indeed go beyond the decorative, symbolizing inner workings of God's infinite and harmoniously ordered universe. As one medieval Islamic scholar put it, "Know, O brother, that the study of sensible geometry leads to skill in all the practical arts, while the study of intelligible geometry leads to skill in the intellectual arts, because this science is one of the gates through which we move to the knowledge of the essence of the soul, and that is the root of all knowledge." Indeed, in the context of Islamic architecture and material culture in general, the application of geometric ornament marked the confluence of art, mathematics, philosophy, and religious convictions, and the same may hold true for floral decoration and arabesque designs, which throughout Islamic history were repeatedly associated with the yearning and visions of paradise. The aesthetic and religious priorities expressed decoratively in the mosques and religious buildings of the Islamic world were also echoed in objects directly associated with or used within those buildings. So here we have on the left a movable wooden mihrab, a prayer niche, with religious inscriptions and geometric star patterns, which was donated to the mausoleum of Sayyida Ruqayya by the wife of a 12th century caliph, and a perfect link between religious architecture, architectural decoration, and religious paraphernalia. Generally positioned to the right of the prayer niche, the minbar or pulpit, like this example made in Cordoba in 1137 for the Qutubiyya Mosque in Marrakesh, was used to deliver the Friday sermon, and remains a common sight in congregational mosques all over the Islamic world to this day. The monumental Quran manuscripts used for recitation in mosques were kept in elaborate Quran cases, as you can see exemplified on the upper left, to protect their ritual purity and prevent excessive handling. For the same reason, elaborate Quran scans were commissioned here below to support the manuscripts during recitation. For the faithful, communal and individual prayer carpets were provided to ensure a ritually pure ground to pray on, and mosque lamps, like this Mamluk example on the lower right, both provided illumination and evoked God's divine light, as clearly implied by the application of the so-called light verse on the lamp's neck, which tells us that God is the light of the heavens and the earth. The likeness of his light is as a lamp, wherein is a light, the light in a glass, the glass as it were a glittering star. Even scientific instruments might have formed part of the Islamic art found in a mosque, because the astrolabe would have been indispensable in determining the correct timings for prayer, the start and end of the month of fasting and pilgrimage, and indeed the calculation of religious feasts. Beyond the sphere of the mosque, as the heart of any Muslim community, and also as the most powerful visual marker of the community's presence in any city, it was the royal palace complex and the court of the ruler which symbolized Islam's political power and legitimacy. Here too, architecture and material culture imbued with Islamic notions played a pivotal role, providing a suitable symbolic backdrop and ambience for the sovereign's supreme authority as enforcer of God's will on earth and as political ruler, whose claim to power, splendor and magnificence were in constant competition with imperial friends and foes elsewhere in the world. In the public parts of the palace complex, as far as we know from surviving examples, symbolism was closely connected to that in the mosque, with the extensive applications of Quranic inscriptions, floral and geometric patterns. As here, for example, in the 15th century Sala de la Justicia at the Alhambra Palace, where the Sultan would have held his audiences and dispensed justice, symbolically installed at the heart, as it were, of God's universe, as symbolized by the starry, heaven-like domed ceiling above. Or here at the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, where the Sultan sat underneath the canopy of the Gate of Felicity. Above him, a monumental thuluth cartouche with the Islamic profession of faith and the seal of his imperial authority most eloquently combined to symbolize the two aspects of his power. The ruler's troops, meanwhile, would have stood guard, the decoration of their armor, weapons, and banners symbolizing the religious and ideological outlook of the state, with inscriptions praying for God's protection, victory against the enemy, and respite in paradise. Outside the palace, the ruler's guards represented the ruler himself. They walked ahead of him in ceremonial processions and also accompanied the sacred textiles the ruler dispatched every year to the holy places in Mecca and Medina with the pilgrimage procession. Perhaps the most important universal symbol of Islamic sovereignty throughout history was the minting of coins. In the early years of Islam, rulers had first continued to use both Byzantine and Persian coinage, before experimenting with the first Islamic modifications, such as replacing the image of the emperor or Shah with that of the Caliph, and the Greek or Pahlavi inscriptions with Arabic. In the end, all these experimentations in figural iconography proved short-lived, and in the 690s, the Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Malik ordered a purely epigraphic coinage, its inscriptions now communicating both the face of the empire and its victorious dogma, which emphasizes the undivided oneness of God and the status of Muhammad as God's messenger, sent to make Islam seal the other religious monotheistic faiths that went before. Most subsequent Islamic dynasties built on the approach to aniconic coinage developed in the 7th century, but each reserved and indeed executed the right to modify it according to their own religious attitudes and political ideologies. You will have noticed up to this point that very few of the colorful artistic masterpieces everybody is familiar with from Islamic survey books have appeared. Those wonderful ceramics, glass and metalwork items, and, of course, the evocative miniature paintings everyone loves best. Where do they all fit into my story? Well, in many cases, as far as we can tell, they appear to have been associated with the more private and personal realms of the house or the palace. And in this context, many of the items used might not have been used by Muslims alone at all. They might well have been used by a broad spectrum of society with many different creeds. Muslims, for example, would have had no objections to the materials used in these examples. Indeed, the ceramic items with the luster sheen might actually have been favored over gold and silver, which was frowned upon in Islamic tradition because they were considered immodest. The general wishes for good health and success on the lamp, down here at the bottom, and the proverb on the plate on the top, on the right, reflect an oral culture of etiquette and the literary arts that was shared and continued to be shared by all intellectuals and cultured people, irrespective of creed. Other items might have appeared more problematic in certain contexts from an Islamic point of view due to their figural decoration, which was frowned upon by Islamic scholars over the centuries in many instances as contravening God's law and creative prerogative. This topic is a highly complex one, and given that the Holy Quran as such only takes issue with idol making, and the Prophet's position on this issue was somewhat ambiguous, it came to be dealt with differently in different Muslim societies, and within those, within different levels of society. The most influential collection of religious traditions openly hostile to figural painting was the Sahih by the 9th century Sunni theologian and scholar al-Bukhari. And given his severity on the matter, we could have expected painting and figural art to be completely absent. But they are not. Figural art does occur throughout Islamic history. And while it is often interpreted as the private pursuit of cultured urban elites and of course royalty, well away from the public, much more conservative eye, its story is much more complex and could, in many cases, also be underpinned by the spiritual philosophies and convictions of their time. To start with, in the early Islamic period, even though they might come from within the Islamic world, some figural artifacts may not have been made for Muslims at all, as they remained a demographic minority in the region at large for over 300 years after Islamic power established itself. Some items, like the 11th century lion sculpture there from Afghanistan, combined pre-Islamic and Islamic traditions. So this little lion fuses universal ancient symbolism as a royal animal with the equally ancient, but of course also Islamic custom of perfuming the air of important buildings or welcoming distinguished guests during special occasions. The cockerel-headed ewer from 12th, 13th century Iran builds on ancient Iranian and Zoroastrian traditions connected with Nowruz, which all of you know is still a very beloved feast to this very day, even in Canada. With the cock, a Zoroastrian symbol of light, but also among the animal-headed vessels mentioned repeatedly in medieval Persian poetry. Yet others created figural themes that emerged from within a worldview that was shaped by a confluence of religion, unorthodox spirituality, literature, and poetry. As, for example, on the candlestick on the upper left, upper right, which comes from a Sufi mystical convent in Anatolia, or the so-called Bobrinsky bucket on the bottom left, which was made in Herat, Afghanistan, in 1163 for a merchant, apparently as a New Year's gift and after his return from the Hajj. Perhaps the most splendid art was reserved for the private world of the Islamic courts, The life lived within secluded sections of palace complexes and mansions, decorated with iconographic schemes that could be a far cry from the demure and restrained face of mosques and public audience chambers. And these included figural mosaics, frescoes, tile work, and even sculpture. It was an otherworldly ambience designed for relaxation and pleasure from public duties for sure, but it was also an ambience in which Islamic notions of exalted royalty and privilege were combined with clear and much celebrated material references to the yearned-for delights of paradise to come, with its soothing gardens, their flora and fauna, their bejeweled clothes and furniture reserved for the faithful. And here's some examples of what that could look like. A privileged life left little time for hobbies, but in the spare hours they had, Islamic rulers and the elite often became artisans themselves. Many devoted themselves to calligraphy, a deeply spiritual as well as artistic activity. Others to the sciences and the making of scientific instruments, to learn more about God's universe and follow the Prophet's directive to seek knowledge even if all the way to China. All of them loved literature and poetry, which was recited and improvised in regular evening gatherings, and which again could be full of spiritual or mystical connotations despite their apparently secular subject matter. Like, for example, the Maqamat of Al-Hariri, written in Iraq in the early 12th century. They consist of 50 unrelated encounters between Al-Harith ibn Hammam al-Basri and Abu Zayd, who is basically a con artist, who uses his unparalleled rhetoric abilities, intellect, and linguistic eloquence to disguise his real self, deceive and manipulate his audiences with the aim, mainly, of exerting money. The work became extremely popular all over the Arab world, partly due to the emergence of a sophisticated urban elite who enjoyed the intellectual and linguistic wizardry of the work. But it also became popular in a very particular religious atmosphere in the 12th and 13th centuries, which saw the emergence of the classical four Islamic law schools, all arguing among each other about what was religiously and morally right and wrong. There was also an emergence of Sufi preoccupations and ideas that combined mystical concepts of the apparent, the dhahir, with the hidden, the batin, meanings that went well beyond mainstream Islamic belief and practice. And it was in this particular atmosphere that this work of the Maqamat is suddenly and widely illustrated. A very strange development, given that the text itself does not lend itself to illustration at all, and only explained by the fact that at that time the public recitation of the Maqamat stories had also become part of the performing arts, including shadow play. And these performances combine images with highly sophisticated, multi-layered texts and public performance to entertain and indeed to invite spiritual contemplation of the illusory and transitory nature of worldly existence, moved by an invisible force and marred by appearances. In Iran, meanwhile, the most popular literary work by far was the Persian epic of kings, the Shahnameh, written by the Persian poet Ferdowsi in the 11th century and profusely illustrated throughout the centuries. Again, the work was generally recited or performed rather than read in private, with the most magnificently illustrated manuscripts commissioned by the court of the Shah for consumption by himself and his immediate, most intimate entourage. Interestingly, in the 16th century, while the images as such still tell the stories of the book, which incidentally recall the exploits of ancient pre-Islamic heroes and kings up to the arrival of Islam, we see these ancient stories depicted in a clearly contemporary garb, in the garb of the 16th century Iran with its Shia head. And the royal heroes and other protagonists wear the costume and armor of the time, wear or hold standards with Shia mottos, and even wear the traditional so-called Taj headdress, a long red headdress that was identified as belonging to adherents of the Shia cause of the Safavids. Now, why would the painters want to do that? The reason for this curious approach again lies with the religious and political expediencies of the time. As the charisma of the Turkoman Shah, he was not Persian, depended on the convincing demonstration both of his emulation of ancient Iranian kings and his role as the supreme imam and leader of the Shia community. Court poets at the same time indeed went to all lengths to liken the Shah's character to those of the ancient legendary kings, describing them as the Khusro of the four climes or the world-conquering Khusro leading the army of the Lord of Time. At the same time, Sufi mystics, close to the Shah's Shia doctrine, celebrated him as the culmination point of the divine wisdom and light handed down by the ancient Persian kings since the beginning of time. I took you on a whirlwind journey that probably made your head spin. But I wanted to give you a glimpse of how Islamic art, in all its complexity, might be viewed from an Islamic and from a culturally Muslim perspective. And I hope I've given you an impression how extraordinarily diverse such perspectives could be across time and space. And that not only religious and spiritual aspects, but also cultural, social, and political aspects impacted the creation, or could impact the creation of any one piece of art at any one time throughout history. But nevertheless, it is important to remember that in pre-modern Islamic cultures, there was no separation as such between religion and spirituality. And that, in fact, was also the case for the other many religious communities that shared in the life in the Islamic world, be it Jews, be it Christians, Zoroastrians, the many different communities, all of whom shared in a common culture away from their respective houses of worship. Thank you very much.